everybody. My apologies for keeping you waiting. I'd like to say I was stuck in traffic, um, but the previous session just ran over a little bit. Jaime, it's lovely to see you. How are you?
Very well. Thank you so much, Kezia. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been a wonderful conference so far.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. And I'm really, really looking forward to hearing your address. I think that it's providing a really interesting angle into these questions that we've been discussing. We're a bit short on time, so I'm going to just push straight into it and to just say that you are the Urban Development, Sustainable Transport and Digitalization Officer of the Delegation of the European Union to the Republic of Kenya. And we are delighted that you're here to share something which I believe is also, it's a passion of yours and something that you hold quite close to your heart as well as to your head, which will make for a wonderful discussion, I'm quite sure. And speaking about your experiences in Sri Lanka and India and how that is relevant in the context of what Kenya is trying to achieve and indeed what we're trying to achieve across the continent. So if I can hand over to you, we've got about 14 minutes or so. Yes.
Thank you, Kezia. Let me try to share my PowerPoint. Let's see if it works.
And if I can just encourage colleagues to please record your questions in the chat, and we'll see if we can answer them in the course of the discussion or afterwards.
Good. Can you see my slide?
I can. Very beautiful.
Excellent. So thank you very much and good morning to everyone. I'm Jaime Royolit, as Kezia has explained. I'm from Spain and I've worked in Cape Verde Islands for 2 years, in Eritrea 3 years, in Sri Lanka for 6, and on and off in India. And since last year, I'm posted here in Kenya. So the title that is on the agenda of the program in India, because I don't dare to say too much about what will happen in Kenya, but in this title, I'm trying to ground it on the state of affairs and state of play of what the EU might do in Kenya in the next 7 years. So off we go. So just for those who might not be too familiar with the European Union or the European Commission, most people don't know is the largest ODA donor in the world, providing more than 50% of it. And for this funding, there's a network of 140 EU delegations worldwide. And these EU delegations are governed by the European Commission, which is like the executive body of the European Union, and the European External Action Service, which is like the diplomatic services. And I work under the Director General for International Cooperation and Development, which is renaming itself from 2021 to Director General for International Partnerships. So we are currently programming the partnership between the EU and Kenya for the 2021 and 2027 period. And the EU does not involve only the European Commission, but involves all the efforts from the European Union member states, their development banks and their development agencies. And the overall package that we have been managing for a similar period until now is about in the order of 4 billion euros in investment, out of which the European Commission provides between 400 to 500 million in subsidies. So the idea is more and more to be using the subsidies of the European Commission as a way of leveraging de-risking investment from development banks and investments from the government, and ideally also from the private sector, which is relevant for this conference. So a little bit of the background on what the EU delegation has been doing. For the last 40 years, we've been working a lot on building roads with the government of Kenya and the rural areas. In urban roads, this is the Nairobi-Lukasa Road, for example, partnering with development banks to provide water supply, or, for example, building the Africa's largest wind farm, which is in Lake Turkana here in Kenya, where the European Commission brought 25 million euros in subsidies and mobilized and de-risked an overall package with the European Investment Bank and other donors of over 600 million euros. For those who are familiar with Nairobi, we're also working since 2015 in trying to improve the situation of urban mobility in Nairobi. One of the major problems being the chaos caused by the disorganized matatus and the pollution. And we are in the process of making a package, again, close to 500 million euros investment with this European Union partners to develop the core Line 3 in Nairobi, and it will be Africa's first clean BRT because we'll be using battery electric buses. A new major pillar priority of the European Union is human-centered digitalization, which is important about what we're going to talk about right now. So what is the state of play of the EU in Kenya on affordable housing? So we are closely engaging with the State Department of Housing, with the government of Kenya, to see how we can go about it. And one of the major entry points with us is working with a major donor in the sector, which is the World Bank. The World Bank is currently developing a prototype for developer-led housing in Naivasha, where the major innovation is the government is bringing land as equity into a special purpose vehicle, such that it doesn't become a fiscal burden for the country. It's a form of what the World Bank calls patient capital. The European Union is now interested in replicating this model because it's very promising, and will be helping the government in developing a similar development in the Naivasha Industrial Park for 2,500 units, and another scheme in Mombasa of 1,300 units. So we will be providing 3 million euros of grant technical assistance to the State Department of Housing, the European Investment Bank 20 million euros, and we hope this will leverage 80 million euros private investment. This might be replicated and further expanded. It's in the process of making. But as you see, Casey, I've been very attentive during your conference, so I'm already going through the publications that have been presented here. So this 2020 yearbook produced by CAF is extremely resourceful. And you see the statistic here where only 12.3% of Kenyans can afford the cheapest housing unit. So we need to do something else for people who can't afford mortgages, people who can't afford the financing for housing. In the sense with a joint conglomerate consortia of UN agencies, mostly led by UN Habitat, on a program that will be building on land governance and green housing supply chains. So this comprises of 3 pillars. The pillar 1 is about land. So if we don't sort out the problem of land, as has repeatedly been mentioned in this conference, it's very difficult to find affordable housing. The second pillar is about slum upgrading, and the third pillar is about affordable green housing. So let me go through those 3 pillars before we will jump on potential lessons from Sri Lanka and India. So the pillar 1 is building on current work from with FAO. The EU has been funding this with 30 million euros and helping the registration of land in rural areas. And what we want to do is to ensure that we reinforce the anti-corruption dimension with UNODC, and that we deploy the global land pool networks methods to make sure the inclusion is guaranteed, such that the digitalization of land registries doesn't become an opportunity for the digitalization of corruption. When there's this opportunity of bringing this these registries from whatever form they exist now, which could be customary, into a formal way, is an opportunity for elite capture. So we're concerned about that. I want to collaborate with the government of Kenya in reducing that risk. And basically, the essential distinctive factor of our approach to land tenure is recognizing that there is a continuum of forms of titles, that there's not just the freehold title that should be considered. And there's 20 years of exhaustive research, namely by Geoffrey Payne, who's been demonstrated the relevance of using these different intermediate forms of tenure, which are important to prevent situations such as the expropriation of people who are on a subsistence economy, for example, and by getting a freehold title would find themselves having to use their house as collateral, and therefore being exposed to the risk of foreclosure and expropriation because they have to pay high levels of debt. Of course, who are we to prevent people from aspiring to get a freehold? That's what people aspire for. But there's a history in Kenya, among other places, about community land trust and other intermediate forms, and we have to see this as an incremental process. I would recommend the listeners to watch this Habitat lecture by Geoffrey Payne, because it's a wonderful 14-minute explanation of this complex notion, but which would do a lot of good for financing institutions that might oversimplify by thinking that freehold is the panacea. So the pillar 2 with UN Habitat is building on 12 years of European Commission funded efforts in participatory slum upgrading. This is a worldwide program that has been investing on preparing the grounds for actions through this participatory means. So it's now time to invest in implementing those. And this is the substance of what could be done. This is the work of Kirsten Sommer from UN Habitat. Will be aligning with the government-led programs in the Kenya Slum Upgrading Program, the KENSUP, and the Kenya Informal Settlements Program to complement them to the extent possible. And the third pillar is about the essence of what I want to discuss with regards to South Asian example. Here, the European Investment Bank might join the European Commission, UN Habitat and UNOPS, in supporting the supply chains, the value chains that facilitate the owner-driven delivery, co-production of housing that we will discuss. This is again an excerpt from the government's approach to affordable housing program, when they're talking about enablers and demand. And for this purpose, the mobilization of different applications that UN agencies have been using in different countries, such as for reconstruction in Nepal, could be used to improve those supply chains. There, I've heard a lot about iBuild as being a successful application here. That's something that we're interested to consider also in this approach. So why owner-driven construction? Well, I want to make the case that owner-driven construction is the best proven approach to build affordable housing to scale, particularly in peri-urban and rural areas. And we'll see this in the case of the history of Sri Lanka and India. So let me go to the previous experience and my working experience in Sri Lanka in the process of reconstruction. So the question at stake is, how can institutions help upscale the production of affordable housing? Okay, and I'm saying that I've chosen the words quite carefully. It's help upscale, scale up the production as opposed to producing it on behalf of people. And in the introductory plenary session of this conference, we heard Andrew from Shelter Afrique. He said there are, of course, many factors for this, the three of them, and one of the main ones that keeps on being underlined here is that we need large-scale PPPs for housing delivery. Okay, so the question is, what do we mean by PPPs usually? Okay, because the notion of private can be subjective. And who delivers the most affordable housing? Well, if we put together in any country which is rapidly urbanizing, and we put all the publicly led housing, and we add up all the private developer-led housing together, they will still not add up to what the informal sector is delivering. In the informal sector, there are lots of actors. There's also a lot of private delivery, but within the informal sector, again, another statistic from Sita Shah's study on affordable housing in Kenya is that 65% of housing in Kenya is produced by owner-driven incremental construction. Okay, there's a plethora of contributions in different forms, but the big bulk comes from there. So the question is, to what extent can PPPs, however big and however we may scale them up, limit or contrive the potential for this people-led? I do believe PPPs are part of the answer. I believe this huge-scale PPPs are important. But let's see whether there might be even other complementary approaches. So in the case of Sri Lanka, in the 1980s, the Prime Minister Premadasa realized that, well, the people are building so much more than we can do as the government or the private sector. So why don't we try an approach where we assist the people instead of substituting the people? Okay, because it's not just about owner-led on themselves, but what can we do to be catalytical? What can we do to be enablers? And how to make sure that we don't contrive this potential of scale. And India delivered in the 1980s, when it had only a population of 10 million, delivered 1 million houses. Well, that is probably about 40% of the stock Of course, demographics was increasing very fast. Now it's more than 22 million inhabitants, but it's a remarkable achievement in the 1980s. Okay, so what is that we can learn from this? So the approach, what they did was what we would call it in longer terms, like a conditional cash grants provided to the households, combined with concessional loans to top up depending on the needs of different households. And through technical assistance, they help the families engage in processes of incremental growth. So sometimes they would have a core house, sometimes they will have a fuller house depending on the needs. But the essence is that it will be led by the owners. Okay, so that will be the long name on the top. Then this kind of approach has many different names in different parts of the world. So beneficiary-led construction, homeowner-driven, assisted self-help, people's processes as U-Inhabited's own name, owner-led construction, owner-driven reconstruction. These are different variations of similar underlying concepts. And the essence of this people's process is that you start from the bottom up, is that you recognize the value added of engaging with people from the very beginning, from planning. But it's not just about participation. If you're talking about people's process, participation can be condescending. In fact, to be owned, they have to be on the driving seat, okay? So to enable that, professionals that engage in this process need to act as supporters as opposed to prescriptors. They need to help them be able to choose what is possible for them to achieve. There's an exchange of knowledge, and we should never undermine how much they know that the professionals such as architects, engineers might be ignoring by providing generic solutions. So this will be kind of the structure of how this assistance work. In a governmental or donor program, 75% of the funds will go for conditional cash grants or loans. 10% of the costs will go for technical assistance and capacity building of those communities. 8% or ideally a little more for ancillary complementary livelihood community infrastructure to make sure they don't lack the essentials, and 7% about indirect costs. And if we think about the household in itself, so I divided this conceptually into what would be the financial part and another part that might not necessarily be monetized, that might not be financial. And this includes the in-kind contributions and the voluntary additions that people can provide to those houses. And I think this is what usually is lacking when we have developer-led projects, because that will be necessarily monetized. And where people feel they own the process, they were willing to provide more out of their own additional savings, their own in-kind contributions, their own sweat equity. There are many ways of calling these things. Often in these projects, the land is owned by the house owners or is facilitated by the government, because governments tend to be land rich, although they might not be fiscally rich. One important clarification is that owner-led doesn't necessarily mean that it is self-built. It can be self-built, but it's not the both thing. The main thing about owner-led is that they're in a position to achieve savings because they are on the driving seat. They get the loan and they get the subsidy, and they subcontract. They're in a position to hire different masons, different builders. Ideally, if the supply chain is competitive, then they can benefit from that competition. If they organize themselves with technical assistance, they organize bulk procurement so they can get better deals for the materials. And who has a better incentive than the owner to supervise that the construction is happening to cost, and that those savings actually are reflected on the overall cost, because savings by a developer will normally reflect as profit for the company, which is absolutely normal. So with that legacy, we were tasked to contribute to the reconstruction in the post-war after 2008, when 300,000 houses have been destroyed in North and East Sri Lanka. So when you deal with persons like this lady who's alone, there's no industrial fabric anymore, has been devastated by the war. She doesn't have a stable income. How can you engage with this person in terms of mortgages? How can you engage with this person in terms of lending? Okay, so we managed to build on this tradition since the 1980s to assist communities build houses like this one. So this is in 2011, okay? So in this house with a total cost of about 5,200 US dollars, so $74 per square meter, we built this house. Now the owner in this case engaged in additional costs for these beautiful doors and windows, which got it into trouble in personal debt. But that gives you a sense of scale. There's another example of another household, again, with huge difficulties to invest in a house. This is the type of houses we built in 2013 with UN Habitat in this case, with support of Australian aid and the Swiss government. Again, around 4,700 US dollars for 55 square meters. And I'm including here the cost of not only the grant to the owners, but also the technical assistance and the indirect costs. Okay, so it is not just construction costs, I'm including that also. The situation persists for many families over the years, and is an example of another house, again with UN Habitat, where the family was particularly proactive in adding a lot, not only in terms of the gardening, look at the root, look at the plants, but also the extension of the house. This house is 85 square meters. Our grant was for 55, that was supposed for 55, but they added so much more. And there's also a philosophical question is, what can you monetize here? Because if they put it from their own in-kind sweat and labor, if it's just by efforts in terms of the beautifying the whole place, can you monetize it? It's very difficult, particularly in rural areas where houses have more of a utility value than an asset value as they do in urban areas. Okay, and again, examples of families with more intermediate forms of shelter, but they are stuck, they kind of move beyond this. And yet another example, and how we try to bring more choices to the families. This is with Habitat for Humanity, giving them different house type options and how they could be adapted in the future. So this is an example of an architect providing the choices and showing how the house could expand in the future. As you see, the more transparent extension on the left of the drawing. And these are examples of how this house is materialized. You can see in the prices how inflation has been kicking in over the years. So this is 2017, we're already talking about $7,000. Again, everything inclusive, technical assistance and indirect costs. So we are around $108 per square meter. This is using earth concrete blocks, which we're trying to do as appropriate technology locally. They happen to be a little bit too expensive, so they were not retained. This is another earth concrete block house, again with a significant input from the owner, which is voluntary. And this is probably the most, the house I'm proudest of in my career as an architect and development practitioner, because this is a compressed stabilized earth block house, which we demonstrated was financially viable, much stronger than the cement blocks, much stronger, reduced about 2 degrees the internal thermal temperature of the house, and we managed to keep it in $6,350 for 55 square meters. So it's 116 US dollars per meter. But of course, this is not just about building this model house, it's about building the supply chain. So as inflation was kicking in, we realized we needed to help the production of locally sourced available materials. And that's an opportunity of generating employment. So again, you're investing into a form of mini industrial policy, generating employment, generating local opportunities. This is a particularly proud women employee of this factory who had been staying at home and found purpose by contributing to the local economy in this factory. And this is the combination of the automated machines imported from Auroville Earth Institute in India, in Sri Lanka. So we organize a South-South technology transfer, and we see the manual machines in the back. So there's huge potential for that. This is an example of another house and how it materialized. And again, you see the order of the prices. We managed to stabilize about 6,500 US dollars for this exemplary houses. We built 250 of this with Habitat for Humanity and World Vision in a program that delivered 2,400 more or less units. Some beneficiaries and users refused to use earth, and they wanted to use the traditional burnt bricks. That's okay. And here the fantastic innovation is a Muslim family who decided, instead of having open windows, to have this ferrous cement perforated windows, which to our surprise happened to be fantastic for wind for cross ventilation, because the small holes, wind gets accelerated through it, and therefore it improves the thermal performance. So again, the ownership leads to creative innovations. And this is another housing type that we offered the end users, but nobody decided to have, because they didn't fancy the notion of a semi-courtyard in rural areas. So what can we, one of the fundamental underlying issues here is that with this owner-driven in Sri Lanka approach, we're able to build at $6,350 when the cheapest, as I see from the studies by CAF, in Africa, led by the market, is in the order of 8,000. So the question is there something universal about this? Are we compare apples and pears? It's worth thinking about. I don't want to say this is something that we can extrapolate here directly, but I think it's worth really thinking about it. And in Sri Lanka, they're convinced that owner-driven approach has reached a stage of irreversibility, although we have to keep on reminding authorities about its relevance, despite they have been doing it for decades. And it's not just the government, it's all these international organizations have participated in this process, okay? But then you will say, well, is 100,000 houses for reconstruction with lots of donor money relevant? How can we bring it to scale? Well, that's where we go to the case of India. India is committed to deliver 30 million rural houses between 2015 and 2022 through this approach. And even through in the urban context, the 20 million intent, it includes a significant number of beneficiary-led construction, that's how they call it, mostly for peri-urban areas. And these are examples of the houses that they are producing. And again, it's in the range of $104 per square meter. Again, the combination of the cash grant and the concessional loan are essential. And the nature of the technical assistance is crucial for this. This is an excerpt from my wife's PhD, who's studying this program, and on the inputs that are provided to this process of owner-led construction, which benefits also from additional complements like rural electrification schemes, etc. But these are not included in the actual cost of the house. Having said that, despite they have achieved very low prices, the effort to buy on families is still pretty high. And this is part of my own PhD research. When we ask people, how does financial debt for housing affect your quality of life? 40% of my interviewees were saying that they were compromising on nutrition. 20% were compromising on education for the children because they have to pay for tuition. And there are other issues of financial independence, emancipation, and dignity. So the question is, okay, so is it after all just a matter of income? Is it an income a solution? Well, again, as part of my research, the essence of a paradox is that this is universal. This is India, but it happens in most countries that as the per capita income increases, the actual index value of housing increases even more. So it seems like even if people are getting very better off, housing affordability becomes at macro level an elusive process. So here we will go back to the question of finance. So what is finance doing? So finance is supposed to help people produce, but increasingly the situation when people are not able to repay or the price become too high, it becomes exploitative. So nobody in the conference has spoken, at least not in the sessions I've seen, about the notion of the difference between financing and financializing. And the essence of financing is an incredible technology. It's a tool to help people achieve more, to be better off. But in the last couple of decades, the technological advances in finance has been more about on the extractive mode, what they can get out of the economy, what they can get out of people, and not necessarily being productive. And I recommend this book on the financialization of housing, A Political Economy Approach by Manuel Albers, which is an excellent overview of this in the US and Europe. So that is reflected in the major structural housing shortfall in India, where most of the housing investments go for those who can afford, but not the 90% who are actually not being able to afford it. And then again, here we have a statement again and again of people saying, well, you know what I need is tenure security. If I know I'm not going to be evicted tomorrow, I will build a house in whatever way. I'll pick up things, I'll build it myself. I don't need help. I don't need finance. I've given up on earning enough finance to build stuff. I can do it myself. We should not idealize, but it's a reminder about the importance of 10-year security. So is more investment on housing production a solution then? Well, again, in India, there's this promise of 1.3 trillion market that will emerge. However, this Pankaj Kapoor is an amazing researcher in real estate in India, explains how massive investments in billions of dollars in India are producing less than half of what they are supposed to be building. Why is it? Why is it that finance is unproductive? So if we go to the micro level again, I have this interviewee who's an IT engineer who's frustrated of not being able to, he's got an MBA, not being able to afford the house that he considers fundamentally decent for his socioeconomic standards. And he explains, well, people have access to loans from banks at low interest rates, but people are investing on land to build a house. No, they're not building a house, they're speculating. And farmlands don't produce, and they're not even building houses. So this issue I thought it was important to bring to this conference about, the illness of unproductive finance. And one of the paradoxes of this unproductive finance, for example, is how money gets poured into real estate that remains empty. And this happens in my own country, Spain, also. So 12% of houses in India in cities are lying vacant, according to this article. And it's difficult to verify all the statistics, but it could be even more. And this is a statistic on the basis of the census about empty homes in India. So an important thing is that stock of housing is not equal to supply. Okay, and we are in a situation where we might be investing a lot of money in fantastic infrastructure and real estate that leads to people-less homes on the one hand and homeless people on the other. So I'm in the conclusion now, Kesia. So I know it's many slides, but almost there. So the essence of what I want to bring here is that in the case of Sri Lanka and India, the cost of developer-led construction was demonstrated again and again to be double that of owner-led construction. And it's very important to ask why. It's no simple answer here. And here we even have to go into philosophical issues about what can be monetized and what cannot be. But the question is the commercially viable market-led affordable solution ever going to arrive? Because that's what many of the organizations here are trying to do. But we don't really have seen a single example of to scale delivery of such housing. Well, I think it's worth pursuing. We need to continue advancing and making progress in delivering such houses, like Riyadh's $10,000 house. However, I don't think they would be able to do it on their own. Back to Kenya, again, the publications shared during this is Sita Shah's study, financed by AFD and Proparco, about Kenya. So we see how people acquire their property, and you see that most of them are inheriting their houses, and then whatever gets produced is mostly owner-led. People's income slowly, gradually, they use their assets to saving here and there, and then the contractor-led, where you will see something that is built in full and then deliver, is a minority. So there's a big gap to be filled. So there's space for everybody. But there's a huge potential in owner-led that we might not be actually considering. So in macro level, what do we conclude? Well, housing finance to be useful to the poor needs more than access to mortgages and the optimizing of construction costs. These are welcome, but they're not sufficient. It is also about regulating a complex political economy. Well, political economy is about power relations in extracting rents, and real estate, housing, and land are essential pillars of that. And for example, reducing the artificially scarce land and housing stocks. So if we don't facilitate security of tenure, if we don't make land available for development, it'll be expensive. And there are many actors who have incentives to make it so. Developer-led housing on their own are unlikely to transfer efficiency savings in cheaper housing prices, as Professor Hook actually explained this. I'm going to that. At the micro level, people's ability to contribute in kind is underestimated. And here is not only about what they call sweat equity, which might be a misnomer, is about, who has the highest incentive to ensure that something is done properly, or that, that the construction is safe, is to standard, that it's done the way they like it, that they can mobilize their cousin to come and help. They can just pawn their jewelry and put a little extra that was not quantified originally. The poorest household need as much financing as they need protection from financialization. And in that sense, security of tenure before bankable freehold titles is something we should be thinking about. The ability to build incrementally before getting mortgages that are unaffordable should be sought for. And smart subsidies are required. You cannot deliver to the very poorest with at least a subsidy. And here's what I go back to Professor Marcia Hook-Smith in the first day of this conference. I was very happy to see that she made a reference exactly to what I've been talking about. The smart use of subsidies to support capacity building and technical assistance to homeowners by Habitat for Humanity. I don't know whether she was referring to this Sri Lanka project that is funded by the EU, but I have to say there's a long history of this in India and Sri Lanka. It's not Habitat for Humanity only, but there's 40, 50 years of this that we have to learn from. And these subsidies, what they're doing, and the reason why you can call them smart is because they're unlocking production, or what we call co-production, production with the people. And these have multiplier effects in the economy. Some speakers spoke about the impacts in health and other aspects. And conditional cash grants are a very useful tool to unlock this in an effective form. So for those who might be frustrated by not having equations, like positivist economists, and talking about PPPs, I'm not saying PPPs should be replaced. On the contrary, we need to scale up PPPs, but perhaps we need to add an additional P in PPPs, a capital big P, which stands for people, people-led, so that we can achieve the scale that they can achieve. And therefore we benefit, we combine it with the standards that the public sector will be able to secure, with the savings that the private sector is very good at achieving, but they have to revert back on the people. And the best way of establishing those partnerships is, instead of having a pre-established single developer, is benefiting from competitive supply chains so that people can choose from them. So if you call it, you want a formula as in of this conference, it will be S4 P4. Finally, this is the final slide. So we've seen how, even in situations of reconstruction, such as in Sri Lanka, where people are very financially poor, the terms in which you engage with them will help you turn them from passive to proactive producers. And producers, not only in terms of labor to build a houses and infrastructure, but if they have ownership of this process, this infrastructure will become homes. And homes have even more added value, which I hope we don't even dare to quantify, because it goes beyond what we can quantify. So financing is key, but it's not all. I heard some certain speakers saying financing is all in housing. Yes, it's key, but it is not all. The terms of engagement matter. There is no shortcut to building adequate and affordable housing to scale, but it can only be achieved with people's and communities' ownership. Owning the building process leads to people investing more on their own development, and this engagement contributes also towards belonging to a community and society at large. So are you up for the challenge? This is all work in progress with the government of Kenya. It'll be very difficult, but I'm going to be here for the next 5 years, and before the 7 deadline of our programming period, I want to try with all the partners and stakeholders that can contribute to prove that we can deliver to scale 55 square meter houses at more or less USD $7,000 per unit. So if you're up for the challenge, don't hesitate to contact me. And if you want more information on what we learned from this process in Sri Lanka, you can download this book for free in the following address. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Javi, thank you. That was a fabulous presentation and completely inspiring. I think what you're talking about here is is ways to unlock the latent potential of people who are already building for themselves and constructing for themselves. And by adding additional capacity or support, we can improve the efficiency and the quality of that, and really leverage all of that personal interest in housing processes to support the wider objectives of the nation itself. But what that then means is that we would need to restructure some of our building approval processes, or the expectations from the regulatory side about how to facilitate those. And then similarly, so the expectations from the financing side. about how to finance those processes. So it's yeah, it's like a re-engineering of the value chain as it is expected by the formal and the government sectors to recognize the innovation that already exists, with households driving their own building processes themselves. That was very good.
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple questions, and we only have about a minute, I'm afraid. So I would welcome you to also engage directly with colleagues in the chat and see who's responded to your presentation. Robin Bonerjee was saying he'd quite like to try this out in Ghana, and maybe you'd like to go with. Um, so that would be, I think, a good conversation to have. Sita was asking about the prices that you were quoting. Of course she was. And she was asking about whether or not land was included in those prices.
Yeah, no, it's a very important fact that this land is not included. So land is usually owned by the homeowners, particularly in the rural areas. In many cases, the government of Sri Lanka was very lax about allowing people to get deeds and titles easily, even if the proofs were not very good, to ensure that they could go ahead. So you would have to add the cost of land to that.
I think that's absolutely fine. I'm very excited about that 7,000 USD number that you're seeking, because of course the costs of production of housing in Kenya are particularly high. And just that very first slide you had about all of the institutions coming together in partnership to promote this, I think puts you on a very good platform, because you're going to have to engage with the state at multiple levels. So lots of enthusiasm in your presentation here. One last question from Malcolm Chabala. The typical returns that investors are looking for in affordable housing projects, do you have a sense of that?
Typical returns. Oh, sorry, what I can see the question. Well, and I mean, in the case of reconstruction, there was no, there was, it was mostly grant finance and small loan components to make sure they learn on the financial discipline. In the case of India, it's state-owned banks and financing institutions that keep very low. I have the returns, I think, in a side. I mean, I can follow this up. Here have the interest rate of 6.5 interest rate in the case of India. That's what they have achieved. But this is state-owned bank. I don't know what this answers the questions, but I have an endless amount of information, and in each state, in each context is different. The question here is that there is a possibility, and it doesn't really exist yet, to do a business case of an owner-led approach. But I think the builder developer has to really think its terms of engagement in a very different way. But that's another whole discussion. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but happy to follow up on bilaterally.
What I did like about one of your earlier slides was how you stacked up the financing and the technical assistance and everything, and that shows also where the different participants can come in. So it's a blended finance model where you added capacity into that as well. And then you would have your investor take, yes, that one, a particular slice of that, and they can get a return there, while you would have the concessional finance and the grants that would make it still affordable for the end user. Because that, in fact, you're teaching all of the participants about how to engage at the very bottom of the market, which I think is quite powerful as well.
Yeah. I think also a fundamental question here, and you explained it very well, is whether you're interested in housing finance, or you're interested in housing and using finance as a tool. And if you use finance as a tool, maybe you have to give space for the non-financial components that add so much to this unlocking of co-production, which otherwise comes as costs in the whole process. And that's where it becomes so interesting. So I think there's a lot of more studies to see how we can benefit from this notion. and make this commercially viable options here, because there's scope for that. And I'll be happy to engage in that
Thank
conversation.
you so much for this detailed presentation, and I can see it's backed up by a whole lot more. And I do hope people go and download that document. It really looks fascinating. Um, I'd like to, we need to close this now. We have the next session that I'm going to is going to be presented by Fatou Dia from SCAT Consulting in Rwanda. Green urban growth, and that's in another room on the sessions tab. Jaime, thank you very much for participating with us, and looking forward to discuss further offline after the conference is done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you for the opportunity, for the wonderful work.